This is his fourth time gracing the Craft Conference stage. Nicktoon is a consultant who helps companies modernize their architecture, organization, and ways of working. He's the author of 3 books: Architecture Modernization, Patterns, Principles, and Practices of Domain-Driven Design, and Designing Autonomous Teams and Services. And the title of his talk is The DDD Treasure Hidden in Plain Sight. Please give a warm pink stage welcome to Mr. Nicktoon.
Hey, man. Hey. So I would like to say I'm happy to be on this stage, but to be honest, down there by that tube, there's a lot of nice warm heat coming out, and I kind of was a bit more comfortable down there. Also want to throw some words of caution out. You know, he said this is the pink tent, it's all nice and sweet in here. But if you look behind this screen, there's a matrix or a grid of these boxes, these strange futuristic machines with flashing green lights. And I'm pretty sure they're trying to hatch some aliens behind there. So I'm going to need an observer to monitor for aliens, because I'm going to be looking this way. And that's you, Dennis. You're the alien guy. How do you feel about that? Thank you. So yeah, this talk's a bit of a niche talk. I wasn't expecting so many people to come. It's about domain-driven design, but if you haven't heard of DDD or if you're experienced with DDD, I think you'll be okay with it. There's nothing advanced or stuff like that in there. In fact, if you are experienced with DDD, you might be a bit offended by this talk, because I'm not really a person who likes traditions. I'm a bit of a troublemaker. I'm always thinking, how can we improve stuff? The past was great, but now we're in the present and we've got the future. How can we keep improving things? So you can probably guess my opinions about King Charles. Don't need to explain that one. So yeah, there's going to be some inflammatory things about DDD, but not too much. So basically, what I want to try and get across to you to start with is, if you've heard of domain-driven design, you might have some negative experiences, like Todd here. For him, it's just an awful thing, lots of confusing terminology, and you might as well use tarot cards to design your architecture than use DDD. He's not the only person who thinks that. The next person is Hana here. She's also got some complaints around this weird terminology in domain-driven design. We've then got Dan and James. They're mocking some of the DDD terminology, like bounded contexts. Again, I see these comments quite often. And Herman here, he's also having some fun with this concept of ubiquitous language, which actually isn't very ubiquitous. So I'm not going to stand here for like 40 minutes and mock DDD, but what I do want to say is, there were some comments, concerns. Not everyone finds it a great utopia where we build great software. And even Eric Evans himself, to be honest, after he wrote the book 10 years later, he said, if I was going to write the book again, I'd do a few things differently. I guess anyone's the same, right? You get some feedback, see how it works out, and you were like, if I could go back in time, I'd do things differently. So what he said is he'd move some chapters later in the book to earlier in the book. And that got me thinking, like, if I could go back in time and I could rewrite history, like, what would I do differently? And I was thinking about this one for a while, and I thought, well, Eric Evans wants to move a couple of chapters, and he's normally like a conservative, moderate, calm, well-thought-out guy, and I'm kind of this troublemaker. So I thought, what would my alternative timeline be? And I decided, he's moving a couple of chapters. I'm going to replace... basically, I thought, I'll just get rid of the whole book and then just keep one chapter. So this would be my alternative DDD timeline. And actually, the reason I say this is because I read the domain-driven design book every couple of years, and there's one chapter, it's called Chapter 8, called Breakthroughs, And I think this really gets across a lot of the concepts in DDD without all of the jargon and the buzzwords. Like, I really feel like if people just read that one chapter, they'd get so much of what domain-driven design is really about, and a lot of those misconceptions wouldn't be so prevalent. So let's jump into this. So first part of the talk is around intuitions of a modeler, and I'll explain this as we go along. So this chapter 8 in domain-driven design, Eric Evans starts by talking about this long New York winter of refactoring. So he's just setting some context here. He's working in New York. He's been refactoring all winter. Oh, what's he been refactoring? So he starts to give us some insights here about what this big refactoring over the winter has been. So him and his team, they had arrived at this nice model, talks about how it captures domain insights and it does some real work. And here at the bottom, you can see they were working on a large application for managing syndicated loans in an investment bank. So just setting the scene here. Then he grabs our attention by explaining how important this project he's working on is. So when Intel wants to build a $1 billion factory, they need a loan that's too big for any single company to take on. So the lenders form a syndicate that pools its resources to support a facility. You don't need to follow all of these domain-specific terminology here. I'm just copying bits of the book, but don't worry too much about the specifics. I'll pull out the key themes as we go along. So then he explains to us exactly what his team's working on. So an investment bank usually acts as a syndicate leader, coordinating transactions and other services, and our project was to build software to track and support this whole process. So now we can see what his team's working on. And now we start getting into some of the DDD aspects and principles starting to pop up. So we were feeling pretty good. 4 months before, we had been in deep trouble with a completely unworkable inherited code base, which we had since wrestled into a coherent model-driven design. So here's one thing I would actually, everyone who inherits a code base thinks it's completely unworkable. So, even Eric Evans has some of our software developer biases built into him. He's a great guy, amazing developer, but, just like the rest of us. But they're not 100% satisfied, and here we start getting to the important part. But there were some disconcerting signs, he says. We kept stumbling over unexpected requirements. I put this in bold because it's interesting. Unexpected requirements that complicated the design. A major example was the creeping understanding that the shares in a facility were only a guideline. So don't worry too much about the specifics, but just think about what's happening here. He's getting these intuitions that something doesn't feel right about his code. And that's really one of the first principles I wanted to pull out here. So after they implemented those complex use cases, they were getting new requirements that came along. They'd implemented the first happy paths, the first 80%, and now they were getting new requirements. And this is the intuition part. He felt like we're adding new features, we're developing the code base, but it feels too complex than it should be. A lot of teams So I would say a lot of the teams I've worked on, this idea of this code feels too complex for the business problem we're solving. It's not something I hear a lot, like if the code works and the requirements are solved, we're generally kind of happy. On a business level, we might say, we've taken some shortcuts, we've skipped out some tests, but what they're saying here is, it's on the business side. The code feels too complex, the domain model feels too complex for the business domain we're working in. So what happens next is they accommodate this by adding loan adjustments to the model, and he talks about this concept of refinements. So this allowed them to keep up. They added this concept to their model, refinements, and it allowed them to keep adding new features, but he's not happy about that. But the complexity was increasing, and we didn't seem to be converging quickly onto really solid functionality. So what's going on here is he's added this new concept to his model, and it's allowing them to keep implementing new features. But his intuition as a domain modeler is saying, this domain model we've got, it's too complex for the business problem we're solving, and this is becoming a problem. Things are starting to take longer to implement. It's not like we've got some messy code, we're missing some tests. He's like, it's the domain issue here. Our understanding of the domain is the problem. So yeah, this is what I was getting across basically. What he's saying is, this code's too complex, but instead of saying we haven't used some design patterns or TDD or some technical thing, he's saying, I don't think we understand the business enough here. We don't understand the domain enough. That's our problem here. But that's my question to you. Like, how many times have you thought that in your career? How many times have you thought this code is too complex? Probably a lot. And how many times have you then thought this code is too complex because I don't understand the domain enough? So that's what I think is the key principle from this first bit of the talk, that intuition of a seasoned domain modeler. You kind of feel like, I don't understand the business problem enough, and that's what we're seeing here in chapter 8. Yeah, so here again, he's talking about there's some basic problem in his model, but he doesn't quite know why, because he doesn't understand the business. So now we get to the second part of the talk. So we've looked at, in this chapter 8, we've learned domain modelers, a good domain modeler has an intuition. They're willing to question their own knowledge of a domain and see that as a potential reason that the code's too complex. Now we'll see how Eric uses concepts from domain-driven design to start addressing this issue. So what happens next is, the problem dawns on Eric. Suddenly, one week it dawned on us what was wrong. Our model tied together facility and loan shares in a way that was not appropriate to the business. So what's happening here is, they've got these two concepts in their domain model, facility and loan, and Eric is saying, the way we have implemented this as developers, the way we've modeled these concepts, that's not how other people in the company think about this domain. This software model doesn't match the domain expert's mental model. So now we get to some of the interesting dramatical bits of the story. So with the business experts nodding, enthusiastically helping, we hashed out a new model on a whiteboard. We walked through numerous scenarios using a visualization of the new model. So again, another principle here is, when you feel like you don't understand enough about the domain you're working in, when you feel like your model's too complex, getting around the whiteboard with business experts discussing scenarios. And this is another key point, I think, from domain-driven design, this concept of concrete scenarios. There's a lot of stuff going on here, don't worry too much. You can check this out after the talk. But basically, Eric Evans has put together this model exploration whirlpool. It's a way to develop domain models and implement them in software in an iterative fashion, which is better aligned to the business expert's mental model. And the key thing I wanted to talk about, the key thing I would point out here, is this bit up here about the concrete scenarios. That's one of the most useful concepts I think I could give to anyone. Like, have you got a concrete example? Just give me a concrete example, basically. Explain something specifically. So let's have a look at this. Let's see how Eric does it. Oh, sorry, before we move on to the story, just another tangent here. In terms of how you can do this in a real situation, there's a concept called example mapping, and it's been adapted into a domain-driven design format. So basically, in talking about scenarios, if you wanted to do this collaboratively with your team and your domain experts and the people, you can simply start by using this simple notation. So an action with a blue post-it is what's someone trying to do in a specific moment, what's the particular action they're taking. In this example, the shop was requesting a refund. So then with the green, we have different scenarios. You can see here 2 to 3 weeks after a purchase, less than 2 weeks after a purchase, and the orange is the results. And in domain-driven design, we normally phrase these as events or domain events. So this is a very simple technique to help you think about, to help you work through these concrete scenarios. When I started with domain-driven design, I wasn't really sure how to actually start working with domain experts. It's not that difficult, really. I find this technique is great. So here's how Eric does this in the example in chapter 8. So he's with the domain experts. He's around this whiteboard. He's not using example mapping. That's a newer thing. But basically, he's got this diagram, and the diagram says that the borrower has chosen to draw an initial 50 million from the 100 million committed under the facility. So he's plugging in some real numbers here, and he talks about the 3 lenders chip in their shares in exact proportion to the facility shares, resulting in a 50 million loan divided among 3 lenders. And so the reason I think this is important is because a lot of times I think we generalize and we abstract things away too early, trying to create a perfect model too early. But actually, what I've learned from domain-driven design, from this chapter, and from Eric himself is, always going through real concrete scenarios. It's one of the easiest things you can do in a workshop if you're not sure where to go next. Give me a concrete scenario, something like this. So, as a result of this, Eric and his team had 2 deep insights. They realized that our investments and loan investments were just 2 special cases of a general and fundamental concept, shares. Shares of a facility, shares of a loan, and shares of a payment distribution. So all of the jargon here doesn't matter too much here, but the key thing is, as a result of working through these concrete scenarios at the whiteboard with the domain experts, they had these insights which helped them to better understand the model they'd implemented in software. So, and this is where we talk about the value of DDD. Remember, he had that problem. We're implementing new features, and it feels too hard and too complex for the problem we're solving. Well, now they've solved it. On the basis of this new way of looking at the domain, how they reorganize those concepts around shares, we could run through every scenario we had ever encountered relatively effortlessly. That sounds, Eric's not a guy who overinflates things and exaggerates things, but that sounds like a very bold claim. I don't know if it's true or not, but anyway, let's imagine it is true. So basically, they've had this breakthrough, and now they've realized by better understanding the domain, by changing our model, we can implement any feature, any scenario we've encountered much more easily. And that's not because of the technical qualities of the code. That's because the code is now better aligned to the domain. It's a better domain model. And this is another concept from domain-driven design, another really interesting concept that I think isn't out there, enough teams thinking about this. So in this example, they had a breakthrough. A breakthrough in their domain knowledge helped them to have a breakthrough in their software model. And when you find these breakthroughs, it can lead to more breakthroughs. What am I trying to say? I guess what I'm trying to say is a lot of teams don't really reflect on these breakthroughs they have in domain understanding. And what I'm encouraging you to do is, just try and notice when your knowledge about some aspect of your domain improves, and keep looking for those breakthroughs. As a developer, keep trying to think, how can I understand some aspect of the domain I'm working in better? Because that breakthrough in knowledge, you don't always know when it will happen, but when it does happen, it can lead to big improvements in your software, as Eric was just talking about. So where are we going from here? Well, we've got an issue. So in the book, they've had this lovely modeling session around the whiteboard. Eric's had his nice breakthrough. On paper, he can go through all of these scenarios, and they're very easy to implement in software, but we haven't actually got to the software bit yet because they were under a severe deadline, and they didn't have the time to refactor their code to this lovely new model. So would they do it or would they not do it? He gives us a bit of a cliffhanger. So in this part 3, the final bit of the chapter, we'll see why these investments in a domain model can be valuable on a technical level and on a business level. So let's start by this comment from Eric. So the gospel of refactoring is that you always go in small steps. You always keep everything working. But in this case, this wasn't going to work here. This modeling breakthrough they've had, it wasn't a sequence of small steps to get from where they were now to where they were there. He wanted to rip things up and do it completely differently. And he says here, there would be few stable stopping points in between. So there's also an interesting point in this part of the chapter. We always come to these conferences and we talk about ideals. You should always refactor in small steps. But here, that wasn't the case. You don't always have to follow the rules. Sometimes you have to not follow the best practices. We've got an example of that here. So what's going to happen in the story? Are they going to refactor it, or are they not going to refactor it? Okay, I'm going to click in that direction. So Eric has to go and speak to his project manager to get approval to do this. And I think this is a great insight here. So the project manager, he gave them the go-ahead. And the project manager said, if things go wrong, I'll handle the heat. I'll let you guys do your refactor, and I'll take the heat for it. We'll come back to that shortly. But again, I've always had tremendous admiration for the courage and trust it took for him to make that decision. And I think the key word there is probably the trust one. I'm going to dig into that a little bit more. So I want you to think about if you were in Eric's situation, or think about a team you've worked with. Imagine you've realized that our code is very complex, overly complex, and implementing new features is taking way longer than it should. And we've found out this new way to model our domain, which will make everything easier, but we've got an important deadline. Could you talk to the product people, the domain experts, and would they understand it? Do you have that trust where they would say, you know what, you're a developer, I trust you to make this decision. If you think this is the right thing to do, I'm going to trust you to do that. I worked with one company, and the CEO said to me, all of our developers have OCD. They're always talking about rewriting the code. And this is an example I see a lot where developers aren't trusted to make these kind of decisions. So actually, I think this part of the story is probably the most remarkable bit, that somehow Eric as a developer and his team, they had a super strong relationship with the project manager to the point where he would say, we're going to risk this whole project, this super important loan syndication project. We're going to miss our deadline just so you can refactor your domain model. That's pretty remarkable, I think. Or maybe the project manager had put an arbitrary deadline and there wasn't a real deadline, so there wasn't much of a problem anyway. I guess only Eric can tell us the real truth on that one. Okay, so the story's not finished yet. There are even more benefits that come out of this one. So this concept of SharePie, they built their domain model around this concept of a SharePie, and it became the fundamental abstraction, the fundamental theme of their code base. The technical people and the business experts, they used it to discuss the system. From this intuition of feeling our domain model isn't correct, to these whiteboard sessions, to refactoring their code, suddenly this new model they've come up with, the developers have driven this, is now the language that the whole company is using to talk about this software. And even the marketing people were using it to explain the features to customers. And all this came from those developer intuitions at the start of the chapter. So here's another principle which I think not enough teams I work with really grasp this one. I think we often think of software development as kind of a one-way street, or a linear flow from left to right. As a developer, we get given requirements and we turn those requirements into code. But actually, when you model these concepts in your code, you're actually creating new concepts. Like, you're changing the domain itself. In this example, Eric and his team, they created this new concept of a share pie that did not exist in the domain before. They've added a new domain concept, and that new concept is affecting marketing, it's affecting the new features that get built. So as a developer, you're actually, the domain is driving your software, but you're also driving the domain. And I think that's important too, that freedom to think there are no constraints here. We're trying to solve problems for our customers, and we can actually change how the domain works, the model, the concepts. We've got some control over that. It's not just a one-way street. And this concept, I see, it's not just Eric Evans who discovered this. Here's Marty Kagan. He's in product management, and he's kind of saying the same thing. He reckons the best single source of innovation is his engineers. He reckons a lot of the best product ideas come from engineers. And this bit down here, if the first time your engineers see a product idea is at sprint planning, you're working in a feature factory, and you're missing an opportunity for your developers to come up with new concepts in your domain, like SharePie was the example in Eric's domain. So a couple of questions around this one. Do you agree with that statement? Do you think developers are a good source of innovation? Maybe you disagree. I'm just saying I believe that. Eric's story, Marty's quote, that matches with my experience. And also, how empowered are the teams you're working with? Is it, when you go back to your work on Monday and you have your sprint planning, will that be the first time people in your team have seen a piece of work when it's about to be planned and implemented? And if it is, just think about all the stuff that happens before that the developers could be involved in. Maybe there's a concept like SharePie that could exist in your organization if your developers were more involved in shaping the domain and product requirements themselves. All right, so they've done the change. The project manager let them make the change. He trusted them to make the change. They've released the software, and then they found another problem, another awkward part of the design. And again, this is another principle. It's just that continuous breakthroughs I was mentioning earlier. When you find one breakthrough, you realize, oh, our knowledge of the domain, we were missing something. And then you start to become more aware, like, oh, maybe there's something else we don't understand. And getting a feeling that intuition builds. So I think it's about momentum. It's not like the one-off example. It's about trying to build momentum for these breakthroughs, always thinking to yourself, there's a breakthrough somewhere. I'm building some software for a business problem. There's a breakthrough somewhere. If I understand something a bit better, I could break through in the model and improve it. And then there'll be another one after that, just continuously looking for those breakthroughs. So, and here's another key principle. This is something, probably the third or fourth time I read the book, this quote stood out to me. Because we naturally assume that as we build software, the software gets more complex, we build up more technical debts, and it just gets harder to implement new features. But actually, what we learn from this chapter is the longer we're building some software, the more domain knowledge we have. So we should be able to build features faster. So there are different approaches there. And so I think this is really a choose your own adventure scenario. Do you want to invest in making sure your developers are properly involved in domain discovery and domain modeling and looking for concepts like SharePie? Over time, by having your developers better understand the domain, even as your code base gets older, you can implement new features faster. But if you're just in a feature factory mindset, things are going to start taking longer, and it's probably going to just be messy code, and from a Formula One car to an old car. So that's basically it. I'm just going to quickly wrap up a few things. So firstly, this talk was kind of just looking at some theoretical concepts, there wasn't too much practical insights in here. If you are interested in DDD and you're looking for some practical concepts and techniques you can apply, there's github.com DDD crew, a bunch of techniques we've put together. Quite a lot of people have contributed to them, and always happy to receive feedback. And here are 4 quick takeaways that I think might be worth reflecting on, although your takeaways might be different. So, firstly, as you go back to your work next week, if you notice that changing the code is harder than it should be, maybe it's your understanding of the domain that's the problem. Maybe you are applying all of the technical practices perfectly, and you've got the best unit tests in the world. Maybe it's the domain understanding that's the problem. Secondly, the domain does drive the design, but also you can drive the domain as well. You can invent new concepts that don't exist in your domain. You can be innovative in almost any way that's helping to solve the business problems that your product is solving. Don't feel too constrained by the language that business and domain experts are using. They don't always have the perfect model in their heads. You have to work with them and help them to develop their understanding too. Then we get to design. So one of the most exciting parts of this chapter, I think, is that conversation with the project manager, where he trusts them to make that big refactoring to their code base just before a big deadline. That investment in improving the design of their code did have a big impact. But in order to do that, Eric had to have the trust. Eric and his team had to have the trust to make that change, because the business understood that this idea the technical team is proposing, that's the right thing to do for the business. And the 4th one here is don't worship the church of DDD. You don't have to follow all these fancy jargons and phrases if you don't want to. You can apply all of the principles, all of the ideas, and all of the concepts in this chapter without using any of that DDD language that people don't like. So 3 quick questions just to finish off. What would be your alternative DDD timeline? If you could go back to the point where Eric Evans writes the DDD book, what would you do differently? Which parts of the talk stand out to you the most? Were there anything that connected to you in particular around the trust, around the whiteboard sessions, around domain knowledge? And if that does stand out to you, just think about why does it stand out to you? Maybe there's something interesting there. What's your intuition? What's that intuition trying to tell you about that thing which stands out to you? And that's it. That's the talk finished. Thank you for sitting through that.
Thank you very much, Nick, for that talk. You broke the ice here at the pink stage.
Just going to check on the aliens.
Okay, please do that.
I think one of them's starting to hatch. But we should be able to do the questions before it properly hatches, so we're good.
Actually, because we got started a little bit late, we have to forego the Q&A for this talk. But good news is, Nick, you're quite a friendly guy, right? If they come to you elsewhere in the conference, you can answer some questions, no?
Well, I'm going to be getting my quad bike out and enjoying some off-roading out here, so if you can catch me, yeah.
Absolutely. So you know where to catch Nick. He'll be
guy on the quad bike.
Very nice.
Yeah.
We have a couple of gifts to say thank you for being here today. The first is a Budapest notebook. Yes, a very lovely notebook for you to remember your time here, your 4th time. And I drew a picture of you. This is not the picture that I drew. This is from a professional artist.
He's got more facial hair than me. I can't grow a beard.
And this is something to remind yourself of this talk you gave here today. So I'd like to present you with this, sir.
Cheers. Thank you.
One more time, big round of applause. Thanks, buddy.